Svalbardtraktaten er et problem Norge har brukt 100 år på å løse. Hei og velkommen til Lørdagsuniversitetet Mini. Hos oss møter du forskere fra UiT i korte foredrag og intervju. Rett på øret, når og hvor du måtte ønske. I dagens episode, som blir den siste før vi tar sommerferie, skal du få høre professor Rossi snakke om et veldig spesielt dokument, Svalbardtraktaten. Av mange blir han beskrevet som et diplomatisk meisterverk, men den har også gitt Norge trøbbel i 100 år. Og nå blir kanskje situasjonen enda mer tilspisset. Og da må vi nordmenn innse noen leie sannheter om oss selv.
I'm fearful that the Arctic is going to be turned into a Grossraum, a sphere of influence, a competitive sphere of influence among capable states. Not necessarily the most powerful states, but capable states. And that's a code, that's a buzzword for those states that are circumpolar to the Arctic itself, sharing a coast. I think that makes them more powerful than simply having a militia. So the Arctic, I fear, is potentially becoming a Grossraum. And my general research agenda has to do with the idea of sovereignty in a world of competition and scarcity, and the prospect of utilizing resources in a way that is rational and less competitive. That's my ultimate agenda. My concern is the Arctic is becoming a Grossraum, and I have a story to tell, and the story actually has a lot to do with Norway. I think it's an appropriate audience to talk about this because I think some of the lessons regarding Norway and its engagement with Svalbard, Spitsbergen, as it was once called, tells us a lot about the tendency of capable states to appropriate or take resources and land when they're capable of doing it for their own purpose of creating a Grossraum, in this case, a Nordic Grossraum. So the story I tell you begins in World War I. As you know, Norway was a neutral in World War I. Norway actually made a lot of money beginning in World War I, trading with both warring constituencies. However, by the end of World War I, it was absolutely clear that Norway was a qualified neutral in the sense that it was quite clearly favoring the British, the French, and the Americans. And so this idea of a qualified neutral, or as the Norwegians sometimes call it, a neutral ally, which, by the way, as we know, it's oxymoronic to be a neutral ally. It's very difficult to achieve that, and Norway learned that lesson badly in World War II when another neutral ally called Sweden made the avenue of Sweden a pathway for Nazi control over Norway. This idea of a neutral ally has failed in international law and international relations, but in 1919 it really came to the service of Norway. And it did so because after World War I ended, the Great War produced the Versailles Conference. Norway, as a neutral ally, was not invited to participate in the Versailles Conference. However, Norway was there at the Versailles Conference as an observer. And we've all heard about the Arctic Council having observer states. It's a very interesting way in which diplomacy can get prosecuted. So Norway shows up at the Versailles Conference, and Norway is gifted by 5 circumstances. The first circumstance is that Germany is not at the Versailles Conference. As the loser in the war, Germany was not invited. The second advantage that Norway had was that Russia was not there either, because Russia had collapsed into a civil war relating to the rise of Bolshevism, and the communists had signed a separate agreement, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which extricated them from the war, but under terrible circumstances that the Russians today remember as redounding very badly in terms of how they have been treated. The Russians have been treated by the Allied powers particularly. So the second reason why Norway was advantaged was because Russia wasn't there. The third reason and the fourth reason has to do with diplomacy. And some of our colleagues here study international relations, as do I, by emphasizing the intricacies of diplomacy related to law, related to politics, in the discussion of geopolitics. So diplomats have a big deal to say about how things get made and interpreted. And the third and fourth reasons why Norway was particularly advantaged as an observer at the Versailles Conference is because of Fritz Wedel Jarlsberg, who was an ambassador, and this guy named Helmer Bryn, who was the foreign minister. They were adept, they were sophisticated, they were nuanced diplomats who prosecuted the Norwegian agenda spectacularly. Even today, it is noted that these diplomats, in conjunction with the Norwegian Storting, they met in closed doors in Oslo and they made a plan. They made a plan to capture diplomatically Spitsbergen. They went to the Versailles Conference. They left the Versailles Conference. They didn't participate in the war. They were observers in the war at the conference. And they end up with 16% more property and territory than when they entered the war. And they entered the war as a neutral. Now, you know that's good diplomacy. Historians today study Fritz Jarlsberg, Wedel Jarlsberg. And if you look to your map, you'll see there's a huge portion of Svalbard named after him. For good reason, you can thank him for his adept diplomacy and what he did. But the fifth reason why this worked out so well for the Norwegians is because of a fellow by the name of Lansing. Robert Lansing, the United States Secretary of State, had a particularly good relationship with the Norwegian diplomats, and for good reason. Robert Lansing wrote an article. It's unusual that a Secretary of State would write an academic article in the leading international law journal talking about the unique status of Svalbard. He did. You can't imagine Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, doing that today, could you? Or for that matter, any foreign minister writing about that in an academic kind of way. But this was how important Svalbard was. And the statistics indicate why. Because Robert Lansing knew that Norway had committed 800 ships, 1,200 merchant marines in support of the Allied cause. And Robert Lansing knew that Norway had suffered tremendous losses. 2,000 mariners were killed in the war, transporting goods to the Allies. 800 ships were lost. Half of the tonnage of Norway's merchant fleet was sunk during World War I. So at the end of Versailles, it became clear that in exchange for Norway's neutrality as a neutral ally, Norway achieved this huge territorial concession at the hands of the Russians, at the hands of the Germans, and actually at the hands of the Swedes. Because you have to remember that for a long time before World War I, there was a negotiation about who owns Spitsbergen. We've already seen the whaling industry. We almost made it to Blubbertown, which is the English word for Smeerenberg, which is a relic place where the Dutch slaughtered flensed whales. We almost made it to that place. There was tremendous fights on these waters over who owned Svalbard, Spitsbergen as it was called, in the 17th century. And just as a sidebar, the Dutch mariners were so good, they were so fantastic, they were such great warriors that they dominated this space. They dominated, and the same captain who dominated Schmierenberg was also showing up off the coast of Chile to dominate the Spanish fleet. And then he showed up in Malaysian waters to dominate and destroy the Portuguese fleet to capture the Spice Island. The Dutch really knew, they were a thalassocracy. They were the power at that time. Of course, you know the United States is the power now. And one day, pretty soon, you might think that China will overtake that. That's a different story. In any event, that's what happened that allowed Norway to obtain Svalbard. But in doing so, they signed a treaty, the Spitsbergen Treaty. And when we think about a treaty, we think about it being a constitutive document. It's a hallowed kind of name. We have to refer to the treaty. What does the treaty say? The treaty allows us to do X. The treaty allows us to do Y. The treaty is kind of like a constitution, which the United States, always talks about. We're a country of laws. We have a foundational document. It has never changed. We refer to it. It is our law. The Germans call it, the basic document, the Grundnorm. This is a common idea. But if you look at this treaty, which everybody refers to here as being, responsible for all that is and all that will be Norwegian, you have to understand that it's oxymoronic as well. There's no way that you can have a treaty that establishes sovereignty, which is what the Spitsbergen Treaty did. It established Norway as the undisputed sovereign of Spitsbergen. However, it was not absolute and unqualified. It granted Norway absolute and full sovereignty, but it also said any other country could have equal access if they signed the treaty and be treated similarly. It's an oxymoron. You can't have sovereignty, which means control, and then qualify it by saying, but you need to share. This is the predicament that Norway has been in ever since. It has not been able to negotiate or articulate a strategy that closes the gap in this fundamental oxymoronic document, which everybody refers to, but nobody completely understands. And I'll tell you why. But we need to know just 2 seconds worth of theory. Original documents cannot be changed unless you have a vote. That's the fundamental idea of very conservative, rule-oriented, modern-day Ronald Reagan type jurists, diplomats, and judges. The most famous of which was a fellow by the name of Antonin Scalia. This is getting too far into the weeds for this audience. But if you know who Antonin Scalia was, he was the most brilliant American jurist who sat on the highest court, and he said that the Constitution and any treaty is dead letter law. It's dead. What he meant by that was, you can't change the terms of the treaty unless we vote on it. You can always change a treaty if you're a Democrat and you vote to change it, but you can't change the original meaning of a treaty without a vote. That's all he said. Why is that conservative? Because there's a whole nother school of law, and I know I'm talking to Scandinavians here. It's called legal realism. And the progenitors of legal realism have a long and established genealogy connected to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Particularly, the kingpin of this idea was a guy named Alf Ross, the Dane. But in any event, legal realism treats documents as if they are organic, as if they grow and develop over time, as if you cannot construe a document written in 1920 to comport with all of the complexities of the world in 2023. I don't think those people knew too much about the geopolitics of today. And so the argument is that the treaty, the 1920 treaty, which changed its name in 1925 to Svalbard. By the way, somebody mentioned the power and the anthropological significance of place naming. Yeah, you got to get that word Spitsbergen out of the treaty, and you got to put a word that is more Nordic in the treaty. That was done intentionally, as you know, to make Svalbard more Nordic, less Germanic. But the Germans were here in the 17th century. The Dutch were here in the 17th century. The British were here in the 17th century. The Swedes were here in the 17th century, and they fought and they killed every whale in this area. And once they started flensing the whales, once they started carving up the whales, not in Blubbertown, but they were able to do it on the boats. And so they chased those right whales all the way over to the Greenland Sea, and they completely eradicated what was left of the only reason they were here to begin with, and that was whaling. And so this area, which nobody cared about except for the whales, silently returned to a status of what was called terra nullius. It was just a no man's land, as it's called. It had no significance because the whales were gone. The only reason humans came back to this area was because of coal. And when the coaling industry ended for the Americans, because this fellow Longyear, you know all about Longyear. That's the capital that's the name of the capital here, Longyearbyen. When his concession ended, when he decided to sell out because he didn't want to do any coaling operation here anymore, the Americans lost complete interest in Svalbard. And Robert Lansing knew that too, and so the Americans weren't at all displeased by allowing its neutral ally to take over the place because the Americans had no interest in this either. So there was a little bit of political gamesmanship going on whereby the Americans receded in terms of their interests. The Germans and the Russians were boxed out. Sweden had been pushed aside, even though in, I think, 1872, 1910, 1912, Sweden was at the table to negotiate a sharing agreement over who gets to share the resources here in Svalbard. But after the Great War, the Swedes were out, the Norwegians were in, and the neutral allies took over. They got what they wanted. That closed-door meeting in Oslo accomplished a political agenda for the Norwegians that granted them almost everything they wanted. They had full and absolute sovereignty over something they also had to share. And this has been the predicament for Norway ever since. I can go into a lot of nitty-gritty details about how Norway's life has been complicated by this oxymoron. Maybe right now is a good time for Norwegian diplomats to start dusting off their history books and looking at the playbook that Vidal Jarlsberg had with Bryn, whereby they knew that the Russians were in a corner through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that they were forced to sign. They knew that there was no more kingdom of Norway and Sweden, Sweden and Norway. They knew that the Germans were out, and so what they did was they made a power play to take over. And I want to use my words, not yours, but I thought I heard you say something like, the world is against the Russians right now. The world is very sympathetic toward the way in which Norway has managed the relationship. And so the idea was that maybe there's a political will right now to see if we can turn this contested space over to our friends who are no longer neutral allies. They're NATO allies. By the way, we were talking about, the encirclement of Russia. It's not simply talk about a space up in the Arctic. I think we should also talk about the Baltic Sea being a NATO lake now, but there's a tremendous complication to what's going on up here in the high north because of what's going on down in Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and the Hanseatic areas that the Norwegians also patrolled for so many years. In any event, I thought I heard you say something about maybe somebody should be talking about how we can checkmate the Russians once again the way that the Norwegians did in 1912, 1919 with the help of Robert Lansing. And that's the kind of mentality that interests me, because I can see people in Oslo scratching their heads saying, yeah, that's a good idea. But the consequences for Norway have been really challenging, almost in a way, not of the mindset of what Norwegian social democracy attempts to achieve. There is no idea of a dugnad by inviting the Germans in or the Russians in to talk about the space, the social democratic space of this Grossraum. And what happened with Norway now having full ownership over Svalbard, except they don't really have full ownership over Svalbard, Norway told the rest of the world that the 1920 treaty could never be changed. So that Norway adopted the juridical, the philosophical rationale of the conservative jurists, just like Antonin Scalia and the Ronald Reagan people. They said, no, you can't change anything without a vote. Okay, so what does the treaty say? The treaty says that Svalbard and its jurisdiction, the power of all those signatories over shared space, only extends to the terra firma, only extends to the dust you can kick on Svalbard, on Spitsbergen, on Fritz Wiedel Jarlsberg land, and it only extends to the territorial sea. That's what the treaty said. We've never voted to change it. Therefore, all of those other signatories to the 1920 treaty only get those goodies that the 1920 treaty provided. The treaty remains intact. It is set in stone. It is dead letter law. It cannot be changed. This is the Norwegian articulation of its position politically, juridically, and intellectually. And nobody's buying it. Nobody believes it, because they're adopting this idea of organic law. The law of the sea has changed in everybody's mind except the Norwegians. Why? Because the Norwegians have attempted to territorialize the space beyond the territorial sea that now extends far, far, far beyond the outer limits of the territorial sea. There are too many good riches that the Norwegians are attempting to take for themselves and not share with anybody else because of the propitious opportunity that was garnered in 1920 that can no longer be changed. That's the position of the Norwegians. But guess what? The Norwegians cannot sustain, or they do not have the courage of that conviction, because they only articulate that view when it's to the benefit of Norway's foreign policy position. If there's other ways that they can obtain territorial control over these areas of geospace beyond the limits of the territorial sea, they pursue it. And so Norway is now saying, well, we want an exclusive economic zone around Svalbard. They tried to say that in 1976, and the reaction was so strong that they retracted that idea, and they came up with another idea, which wasn't even their own idea. They borrowed an idea from Denmark and the Faroe Islands, because the Danes had said, well, we're going to create a fishery protection zone. Everybody said, what's that? That doesn't exist in international law. You're just making that up. Well, by the way, they also kind of quietly said, remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Remember how the United States put a blockade around Cuba? But you can't put a blockade around Cuba because that's an act of war. So the United States said, well, we won't call it a blockade, we'll call it a quarantine. And everybody said, what's that? Well, it's like a fishing protection zone, only it's... So they tried to make this fishing protection zone. They still claim a fishing protection zone. We talked about the fishing protection zone yesterday, and I was mentioning, although Kito, we had a conversation, you said, well, there has been patrols, and they've been enforcing, the proper administration. They've been punishing the Russians for doing bad things in this area. Sometimes now there are examples where some people say they turned a blind eye. But they only do that with the Russians. Vis-a-vis the Europeans, they want to keep them out. Vis-a-vis the creeping snow crabs that have come into these waters, they want to say they're ours, nobody else's. They haven't been able to perfect their property interest over this so-called fishery protection zone, no matter how hard they try, because the consequences of doing this, of taking this space that might belong to everybody else, is too politically problematic. Not only that, a couple more things. If you look at this 1920 treaty, you'll see that Norway already has agreed to change the terms of the treaty, or they agreed that the treaty is organic, not set in stone, in three ways. One way is over taxing structure. Norway, you know that the taxes are controlled by the treaty, but they also agreed that the taxes could change over time, and Norway has extended most favored nation status to all the signatories, which never even existed in terms of 1920. So they've kind of changed the agreement already in that regard. If you read the agreement again, you'll see that it says that it gives special attention to Russians, not Russian nationals. Well, Russia didn't even exist at that time. It was in a civil war, and Norway knew it, and everybody else knew it. But they also knew that, Barentsburg was there. They knew that the Russians were up there since the time of the Pomars in the 12th century. They knew that Russia had this long and established tradition in the high north, and so they actually nobody could countenance the idea of completely boxing out the Russians. So in the treaty itself, the treaty says, when the time is right, we'll include the Russians. So they put into the treaty what's called a pactum de contrahendu. It's a fancy word, but it just says, we'll agree to deal with that when the time comes. But we kind of reckon, it's an agreement to agree to something in the future. Honey, I love you, let's do what we do. But about that one thing, about having kids, let's just talk about that later. That's a pactum de contrahendu. It's an agreement to come to an agreement later on. So they agreed to that as well. The other provision they agreed to had to do with mining. The Norwegians agreed to that, but they had the obligation in the future to agree to the mining code. So that treaty, for three reasons alone, was never set in stone. Not only that, later on, the Norwegians actually extended the territorial sea, which was at 1920 was 3 nautical miles. They extended it on their own for everybody else to 12 nautical miles to comport with this law of the sea convention. But there's all these other developments. The international law of the sea has grown like a baby grows, organically, ontologically, like the Scandinavian realists said that it would. You can't configure law made for one condition completely, out of mind of what's going on today. And what's going on today is that we have all these other regimes. We have the exclusive economic zone, we have the continental shelf, we have the extended continental shelf, we have the contiguous zone, we have the area, and we have all of these administrations that suggest that the law of the sea now more properly is reflected not by the 1920 agreement, but by something else which Norway has signed and believes in, except with regard to the Svalbard Treaty, which is set in stone, which they've actually modified with those 3 examples I gave you, with the articulation of the territorial sea, which is now longer. And the funniest thing relating to Svalbard, the most difficult thing that the Norwegians have gotten themselves into is they try to say that all the water space between Nordkapp and Svalbard's continental shelf belongs to Norway. It's one big, gigantic proprietary interest, except when the Norwegians delimited the boundary space between Svalbard and eastern Greenland, they didn't adhere to that rule, that so-called rule. And then when the Norwegians made a deal with the Russians over something called the loophole, they didn't agree with that either. So they changed their mind in the middle of negotiations depending upon what opportunistically works well for them. So, Norway has been pursuing a two-track policy. They have been institutionalizing practices to sidestep controversy regarding the fishery protection zone while they attempt to buy time to build political support for its now 50-year-old unrequited ambition to territorialize water and geospace adjacent to Svalbard to create an outright grunnnorm, or grossraum, and establish a greater regime for Norway in the Arctic. I don't think this is going to work. I think Norway needs to come to the table. I think Norway actually doesn't like to be put in a position whereby they are against the world. It's not according to the Norwegian mentality. It doesn't comport with the special relationship Norway has with moral rectitude, which is a good foreign policy objective if you can achieve it. And it creates a lot of problems diplomatically. However, it's a good idea now geopolitically to think, how can this space, which is rapidly changing, redound favorably to countries of a like-minded ethos, particularly when the Chinese Navy is now about to surpass the United States' Navy. We're going to have a new sheriff in town on the waterway. And that's going to create a great problem. Not up here first. It's going to happen in the South China Sea, or maybe even Taiwan. But if it can happen there, it can happen here. So my general interest is to think about this space, this giant space, and wonder the way in which we can come to some sort of meaningful way to project the interests of, I'll say a dirty word because I'm a wannabe person in this regard, liberalism. I want to establish liberal values of free trade. I know I just blew up my argument. I want to establish principles of liberalism, free trade, openness, transparency, in a way that can facilitate interest and rationally manage this entire space. If we continue to play the 1919 game, we might have problems. But I'll end that because I can see I have tremendous competition. By the way, it's called the albatross, and so I don't want to hang that around my neck, if you know that expression. Thank you.